Now, I'm glad it's not as hot as it was on Monday or Tuesday, and I guess most of you are as well. I don't know about you, but when we endure that sort of heat, it's hard to do anything, hard to even think. You just want to be, to exist, to not move about, to try and be as cool as you can. But I'm going to ask you to think this morning, I'm afraid. So here's the question for you. I want you to think of an occasion when you had to learn something, whether it be a skill or something at school or something else in your life, where you had to be taught to do something for the first time. I don't know what comes to mind, but when I reflected upon this, I thought of a few things where I could vividly remember having to learn. And sometimes that learning was successful and I could do the thing, and sometimes it wasn't. The first thing I remembered was being taught how to tie my shoelaces. Can you remember being taught to tie your shoelaces? My mum taught me, of course. Didn't have any Velcro shoes in those days, so you had to learn. And I was pretty rubbish at it. In fact, I think that the way in which I tie my shoes now is not the approved, accredited way. It's a way I evolved to make it work. So I got there eventually. The second thing that came back to mind was learning to play the piano. My mum decided that she would send me for piano lessons. I guess I was about 9 or 10. And I went to this piano teacher who was a really quite strange man. He'd been a member of the Halle Orchestra in Manchester, which is where we lived. And I don't know how famous he was, but he was a skilled musician. But I didn't like him at all. And I was booked in for 8 lessons, and I kept saying to Mum, I really don't want to go. But she'd insist, we paid for 8 lessons, you'll have them. And on the 8th lesson, I didn't manage to get to the end. I actually ran away from his house and ran home. So that was something that I was trying to learn to do and didn't manage. Then 2 things came to mind that came together actually: learning French at school and learning to ride a motorcycle. Now you may say, well, what on earth have they got to do with each other? Well, the thing they have to do with each other is that I was rubbish at languages at school, and I managed to fail my French O-level twice. But the day I failed it the second time, I passed my motorbike test on the same day later on. So that stuck in my memory. One skill I could learn, the other I couldn't. And then there was learning to drive a car, and I can vividly remember my first lesson. I was at university in Bradford, and I was having lessons there. My parents didn't have a car. I wasn't used to being in a car, but they had helped me pay for lessons. And so the very first lesson was a bit of a struggle, I have to confess. But I was determined to succeed, and I said to myself, yes, it's awful today, but if I keep on going, keep listening to what this instructor is telling me, I will get there in the end. So those are the things that came back to my mind. I don't know what's come to your mind. Anybody resonate with any of those or have their own thoughts? Yes?
Yeah, on your language, I don't have to take it for GCSE.
You don't have to take what subject?
French.
French. Oh, really? Wow. Well, it's a good skill to have, but not everybody's mind works in a way that they can learn another language. At least that's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it.
Learning to type on a manual typewriter.
That's a real skill. Learning to type on a manual typewriter. No delete buttons. Carriage return. Snowpate, did you need that occasionally?
Came out a bit later.
But it sounds like you cracked it though.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. So in our lives, we are encouraged to learn, and often when we're encouraged to learn, there are people there to teachers. So in my case, I had my mum teaching me how to tie my shoes. I had a teacher at school teaching me French. I had people who were giving me tuition in learning to ride a motorcycle and a car. And so each case I got through by being taught by someone who had the skills already. Now, you'll see from our order of service today that in our Bible reading from Luke's Gospel, the disciples want Jesus to teach them something. They want Jesus to teach them how to pray. Well, who better to teach them how to pray to God than the Son of God? And in Luke's Gospel, in more than any of the other Gospels, we read of lots of examples when Jesus himself is praying. And it's one of these examples that this request from the disciples comes from. They've seen Jesus in prayer and they want to learn how to pray themselves. And there are often the examples that you read in Luke's Gospel, they're at big moments in the life of Jesus. So when he's choosing his disciples, he's praying to God. And of course, on the night before he was crucified, he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, almost 2,000 years later, we've already prayed to God this morning the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples nearly 2,000 years ago. So it seems to me that if it stood that test of time, it must be a very special prayer. And we know it, of course, as the Lord's Prayer. Now, we could spend hours and hours going through the Lord's Prayer. There's so much material for sermons and talks, word by word, line by line. You'd be pleased to know we're not going to do that this morning. Too warm to spend too long doing that. But the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples was not what they were expecting. The prayers of the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the priests and so on in those days, they were often very long prayers, full of long, big words, big expressions. But instead, when we come to read this prayer that Jesus taught us, we see what a simple prayer it is. So it's often the case when we ask God when we pray to God, when we bring a question to God, then the answer isn't what we're expecting. And that was the case when the disciples were taught to pray by Jesus. It's a prayer of such great simplicity and beauty. It can actually be said, the shortened version that you'll hear in a moment from the Bible reading, can be said in a single breath. And that prayer is so powerful. So if you ever find yourself uncertain of what to pray, then I'd encourage you to go back to the Lord's Prayer. And also if you're thinking about the structure of your prayers to God, again, the Lord's Prayer gives us a good framework, a good template to use for our own prayers.